Thanks for making the Locked On Ole Miss podcast your first listen every day. We're free and available wherever you get your podcast, including YouTube. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Hey, this is a reminder tonight when Ole Miss takes on Georgia Tech at 6:30 Central, you can catch all the action on your hometown broadcast with SiriusXM on Channel 81, or you can search on SXM Ole Miss Rebels. The Locked On Ole Miss podcast is on there as well. I'm here with Brian Smith. We're talking recruiting as best we can. We're in the middle of the season. We're honestly talking a little bit just like football in general, because we're having like off-air discussions about why is the SEC so down, and we're probably going to hit on that a little bit as well. So how you doing, Brian?
I'm doing well, sir. What's going on in your neck of the woods?
Pretty good. Ole Miss fans are panicking about a 17-point win on the road against a ranked team. So I'm in a different place than I was 5 years ago.
If that's your problem, then you have first world problems, not third world problems. Be happy.
Yes. It's weird situations. You got the LSU fan base that's like complaining and losing their mind over a 72-10 win over Grambling. I mean,
LSU fans thought they were going to the playoff, so their season in their mind is already over. They're going to be miserable all year. It's just the way it is.
Yeah, and I can't wait for them to get to Oxford. There's a chance there's an 8:15 kickoff SEC window that weekend. Ole Miss and LSU at 8:15 at night. That could be interesting. So
on many fronts.
Yes. There's a couple of rumors that are floating around, and I just kind of want to do a little bit of a temperature check because there's not really any recruiting news that has happened yet. There's people taking unofficial visits. The one thing that's happened is Camarian showed up for the Mercer game, which we said even before he committed that Camarian needed to get to Oxford in September, and he did that immediately. I think Camarian is going to be back again. Dylan Hipp's there. Andy Jaffe's coming in. Maurice Davis is going to visit. A lot of their commits are going in to see the team. So it's not necessarily a big recruiting weekend, but it feels like the group is kind of coalescing around each other, which is going to help them in the next 2 months in recruiting because they'll be able to control their message.
If you have guys that get along and all communicate as commitments, it's going to bode well for that program. Sounds like Ole Miss is on that path, and like Jaffe's a kid I know and et cetera. Those are the kind of kids you want leading your class. So that's good news for the Rebs.
Yes, absolutely. So there's two kid players that there's a lot of smoke, not necessarily saying their visit. There's a lot of smoke that they might visit. And the first one is Jimothy Lewis. And there's rumors abound that he is going to be visiting Ole Miss for the Arkansas game. What kind of crosses your mind whenever you think about that?
Well, he's a Mississippi kid. He was recruited by Ole Miss, and he's been there, half dozen times in the last year or two, give or take, something like that. I'd be surprised if he didn't visit the Rebels at some point this year. I don't know what the policy is at Mississippi State, but it's not like they're dictating to the rest of the world on how recruiting works. So I shouldn't be surprised, and neither should anybody else, if Jimothy Lewis does end up in Oxford.
Yeah, and I think 9 days prior to his Mississippi State commitment, he visited Ole Miss 3 times. Recruiting's weird, man.
That is a really unique stat.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how to take that, to be really honest with you, Stephen.
Yeah.
That doesn't bode well for like the normal logic. Like my brain might explode.
Yeah. I mean, he went out there, he worked up with the defense or the offensive line coach. He did it was just weird. Of course, that was also in the middle, I guess, in the heart of camp season. I think that was in June as well. So maybe that was involved. Who knows what's going on? Let's go on to another player that, honestly, this tight end was really hot and heavy on Ole Miss football. Ole Miss was actually recruiting him as a wide receiver. It's Caleb Odom. He ended up committing to Alabama. I think this might be less likely than Jimothy. And I think this may be like a reverse bump type situation after seeing what Texas did to Alabama over the weekend.
Alabama did not look like Alabama. And you and I were discussing that prior to the show beginning. And I'm just guessing that he wants to make sure this is the place he wants to go, which is fine. I've met Caleb, great kid. But if you look at the numbers, Jackson Dart's averaging 300 yards and 3 touchdowns a game. And Alabama doesn't understand what a forward pass is right now, unless it's a bomb, which is bizarre. That should be the harder pass, but that's the one they do better with. They've got serious quarterback issues, while at the other side of it, Lane Kiffin's got a loaded quarterback room. So the way I look at it is you just got to keep recruiting him. Why not Ole Miss? He fits in better to the offensive scheme and certainly with the quarterback position.
Yeah, and you have a situation just like what we talked about Noreel White like 4 months ago.
Exactly. It's the same deal, 100%. Why not?
If Ole Miss keeps pressuring him and Alabama drops another game or two, in fact, 7 days from today, Ole Miss is going into Tuscaloosa to play Alabama on CBS. Caleb's going to see that one. He's going to get an apples to apples comparison that day.
If they lose that game, recruiting will be very interesting. I mean, I cover recruiting nationally and especially the South. I have contacts that cover Alabama religiously, etc. There will be additional texts and phone calls made prior and definitely if they lose that game to Ole Miss after that contest.
There's a rumor. I host another show, SEC After Dark, with somebody from Alabama, and apparently there's a rumor in the Alabama sphere that Nick Saban has told close friends that this is his last year.
That would be interesting. I mean, it could be. He was pretty mundane after they lost to the Horns. Like, he can be visibly shaken pretty easily. Obviously, he's a thin-skinned guy. But his press conference wasn't a Nick Saban press conference. And for those watching this podcast, they know what that means. They probably, I would assume most of them can't stand the guy because he's at Alabama, but they understand his personality. Sometimes you can just kind of tell like when it's time. And I believe Nick is 72 this year. He's somewhere right around there. Ironically and fittingly, for those of you who don't know, his birthday is Halloween. So he's an odd guy. So that kind of fits. But I'm curious if even if he's not planning it, if they went 8-4, would he want to come back to right the ship, or would Nick just walk away? Which do you think it would be, Stephen?
I think
that's a hard one for me because I went back and forth on that.
It is. But what I like to think of, I'm old enough to remember that what happened with Bear Bryant, where he basically coached his last game at Alabama, and I think he was dead 6 months later.
He was.
Yeah, and I don't know if Nick Saban, if he's thinking about, hey, I want to enjoy being retired. He just bought like a $10 million house in South Florida on the water. Yeah. And you know, I think he wants to hang out with Miss Terry and kind of be a grandpa and all of that stuff a little bit as well. I mean, he's an intense guy, but you know, everybody talked about it as like, hey, at media days, Nick Saban was laughing and having a good time. You know what that means? I don't think people realize. I think that meant that maybe this was his last rodeo and he was just enjoying it and soaking it in more so than, hey, I know what I have. I'm going to beat down everybody like it's 2011.
Well, you know what? Eventually he had to retire anyway. It's coming sooner than later.
Yeah.
I think that's one
undefeated.
Yeah. And it shall remain so.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think he's going to make it in the next 3 years because he's too hard on himself, especially if they don't find a quarterback. Look, I love Jalen Milroe's potential, but when you throw it to the team that has a different color jersey than you, you're not very good. And they got problems. So I'm not saying Nick Saban can't help fix some of that, but this is not a typical Bama team. And I don't think they can get their playmakers the ball the way they should. There could be a lot of stuff happening in Tuscaloosa over the next 6-12 months.
Yeah. And the SEC as a whole is down. And I think the transfer portal is to blame for the SEC 100%. Being down because all of the depth that just kind of was a separator that made the SEC and not the Pac-12 or the Big 12.
Sure.
Well, now those guys are going to the Pac-12 and Big 12. They might not be as good as the front end guys, but it gets a little bit closer because you know, they got a little bit better. The backups are better than their starters. And I think you're seeing that all over. Now, that's good news for Ole Miss.
Because they're leaving Georgia, Alabama, Florida.
Yeah. That's good news for Ole Miss. And you look at the SEC West, there's probably 4 teams that can win the SEC West this year?
At least. Yeah, it's wide open, brother. When have we ever said that? Ever?
Not since before Nick Saban.
It's LSU or Alabama's to pick, pretty much every year for a decade plus. And here recently, it's just been all Alabama.
You know when it probably was? It was when Tennessee and Florida was boat racing the SEC in the late 90s. And the SEC West was like Arkansas, Alabama, Mississippi State. There was just like a glob of teams. Yeah, basically the West was what the East is now. That's probably the last time that something like this happened.
Right before Nick got to LSU. Mm-hmm. And of course that changed pretty quick. You give Nick that kind of talent dispersal and things will change. Yeah. But that was a much younger day. That's 25 years ago. So
yeah. I believe it or not, I on YouTube I watched like the Ole Miss Oklahoma game from 1999. It's amazing. It's amazing how different football looks now.
Tight ends, what are those? Like inline tight ends. Let me be specific.
Fullbacks.
In the SEC, you had to have at least one every other class. Now, hardly any fullback in the country is offered at any level. You can't play tight end. You don't, that's it, bro.
Yeah, it's absolutely nuts. Anyway, where are you going this weekend? Or where did you go this weekend since this is a Saturday air?
Well, I mean, we're looking at a couple of different things. Number one, got to get to at least one game a year that is different. Daytona Beach mainland is the one Friday night game. That's the key. I needed to see LJ McCray. He's a lot like Camarion. So I went with that. And I'm also kind of curious if there's any Saturday games tonight. I might go to something, but there's probably not. Probably just watch college.
Okay. Sounds like it's going to be pretty good. It's kind of people want to complain about today's slate of college football, but it was like, hey, everybody, we were 4 weeks away from watching the Little League World Series on TV. Just calm down and enjoy this. And most of the time when it's a bad weekend or they say it's a bad weekend, something crazy happens.
College football always brings us something. I just allow it to happen. I don't worry about predicting what it is. It's the most incredible thing we have in sport in America because of the pageantry that goes with it. And it is still very unpredictable. That's why you have 20-point underdogs win games. How many other sports do you see that? It's just not that common.
Yeah.
So football is weird, man, but it makes it enjoyable to watch.
Thank you for making the Locked On Ole Miss podcast your first listen every day. We're free and available wherever you get your podcast, including YouTube. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. If you're traveling to the Ole Miss Georgia Tech game tonight, be careful. And Brian, thank you so much for joining us today. And we'll see you next week, bud.
I appreciate it, sir. Enjoy the games.